Oggi la giornata si articolerà in due momenti. Iniziamo il laboratorio da Basso con Haizea Barcenilla, che è una curatrice che viene dal País Basco. Si concentrerà sull'idea del common. E nel pomeriggio invece lavoreremo con Lungomare e parleranno più dell'idea di come intervenire nella località e come gestire quest'idea del luogo ma anche dell'internazionale. In qualche modo per noi questi due interventi sono molto importanti perché ci danno una fonte di ispirazione per capire come utilizzare le pratiche curatoriali all'interno del nostro territorio e anche per capire come poter creare dei modelli che possono essere sostenibili e adattabili a dei luoghi specifici. Grazie. Se avete da fare qualsiasi domanda vi prego di richiedere il microfono perché altrimenti in streaming il pubblico non riesce a sentire quello che stiamo dicendo.
So, hello everyone, I'm going to talk in English. I feel a little bit like Madonna is the first time I use this kind of thing. So I hope it's going to be more or less natural. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was invited 2 years ago for a workshop where I met people in Basel, and I thought it was a very interesting place. And I'm really happy to come and meet more people working here. It's a setting that is a bit outputting because I'm here with my Madonna microphone and you're sitting there, but don't have any problems. I would really like it for you to ask, participate, and in fact I will be asking some things that I think it's more interesting if we do it between all of us, like a couple of things. But well, I'm going to talk today and I'm going to talk on Thursday too. I have 2 sessions. So today it's going to be maybe a bit more theoretical, or at least it's going to be a bit more of me talking and giving examples and bringing up ideas that I think might be interesting, or at least are very interesting for me. And on Thursday probably it will be more based on Bari and in how can we apply the ideas that I will introduce today to Bari or to other places if in the region or whatever you might bring up. So yes, I don't know. I think I'm going to start. I was going to do a presentation run, but we are a bit short of time. But please, as I said, at any point, just feel free to interrupt me or to ask whatever you want to ask. Think of the microphone so that people in streaming can hear what you're saying. But for the rest, just go ahead. I don't have any problems with you interrupting me. So. Well, that's my name. As I said, I'm going to do a short introduction about myself. Not so much to talk about myself, but to talk about how I did come to the idea of the commons and why is it interesting for me. Because I normally don't talk so much about what I did before because I don't think that's so relevant. But I think in this case, it has helped me to understand why I came to this idea, and it might be interesting for you to see how. I don't know. Well, I'll start. So I studied history of art. I'm going back there, and I'm saying this because for me it's important to think that there are people who are coming more from art practice to curating, or that are coming from other practices that are more hands-on or more learning through doing. And I had a very classical education in art history, so it was very theoretical and very based in art history and very, very often in very historical times. So when I finished my schooling, I didn't know very well what to do because I didn't know if I wanted to go into research, if I wanted to do something more practical. I wanted to learn more about what you can work and how you can work with history, with art, with different things. So I applied for scholarships, and I got one scholarship that took me to the Louvre in France. So I was an intern at the Louvre for 6 months, not long, but it was a very interesting experience for me because, in fact, it's a huge institution. So you will see how I started working in huge institutions and then got to not so huge things. It's enormous, and I was working in the Department of Graphic Arts with a curator who was quite a character. His name is Régis Michel, and although he's a specialist in Jericho, he was most of the time he was writing about video art. So it was very interesting for me to see how he could mix different times and how he could apply different theories, and I thought, well, this is much more interesting than just sitting and reading books or I don't know. I really enjoyed it. It was very inspirational for me how he worked, but also it was very interesting for me to work in such a huge institution and see what's the dynamics of this place and what are the little battles between the conservateur and what's the kind of dirty things going behind it and how it's about power and you really got to see things that are kind of unbelievable. So I also got a very strange experience from it where I said like, well, I don't know if I really want to work in a place like this. You know, it's been a very interesting experience, but I don't know if this is for me. So when I finished my scholarship there, I thought, well, what I can do now, and I applied for another scholarship in another huge institution, which is the Guggenheim Bilbao, because I'm actually from the Basque Country, but I'm not from Bilbao. I'm from another area. So until I went to Bilbao, this was in 2005, I really didn't know Bilbao so well. I did know the city and so on, but always like someone who comes to spend the day or has a couple of friends here, but not really like living in the city. So I applied for this scholarship and I thought, well, it can be interesting, let's go there. And then I got to the Guggenheim, and this was another very important experience for me, also in terms of how you don't want to work. Because well, I don't want to expand enormously, but basically the Guggenheim in Bilbao doesn't curate anything, doesn't produce its exhibitions. It brings them from outside. So you have coordinators who bring the exhibitions, mount them and dismount them, but you don't have anyone working with ideas. In the whole year I was there, I only saw 2 artists walk into the museum to talk with the staff in there, and they both came because they actually worked in the children program, in the mediation program, so they just came to give their impressions. Most of the time, the people working in the educational program where I was as a research intern, there was no relationship between the spaces and between the people. The people who were, some people that were like doing guided tours and programs with children and teenagers, I never got to meet in a year because there was an absolute disconnection between what you were doing in the offices and what was going on in the spaces. So I was very shocked, and it was not a museum, it was administration office, and but with all the bad things of, well, I don't want to expand very much, but if you want to ask things, then later we can come back to it, but I don't want to stay here forever. But still, it was a time where I thought, well, now I've seen how big institutions work, and then I was in Bilbao for the first time, and when I went out to the city or met people, went to other openings, or just went to the cinema, went out with friends, I had the impression that the Guggenheim was one thing and the city was another one, and there was absolutely no connection between them. Just like a little example of how the Guggenheim works, I think it reveals very much of its way of working. Interns weren't allowed to go to the openings because the openings are most of the invitations of the openings are given to the patrons, and they count the food they're giving. So if interns go, since they had at the time about 70 interns in different departments, most of them doing guided tours. If they did go to the openings, they couldn't have enough food for the patrons. They didn't want to pay more food, so you would be working like 6 months in an exhibition, and then you weren't allowed to go to the opening. So no one from the city, like artists from the city, could never go to the openings at the Guggenheim because they were not invited. So it was a very strange situation. So well, after being there, I decided I wanted to learn more. I wanted to do an MA, and I went to Goldsmiths College for different reasons. I ended up there doing a master's degree in curating, and this was another shocking experience for me, and it was a good experience in general, but it was quite shocking in some senses. The first one was that it was the first time that I got to work really with artists. That was the very good thing, because we were in the fine arts department, so you were with workers. We had presentations with artists all the time, and we were in their studios all the time. Actually, we were in the same building, so you could just go to the studio, sit there, chat. So it was a great experience for me, coming from a very theoretical background, to work with artists directly in their studio and know how they work. But there were 2 things that came with Goldsmiths that made me think a lot and were not that pleasant, but made me learn very much. One of them was the idea of politics, because everyone was talking about politics all the time and democracy and how this exhibition is very political and how we can address politics without going political really, or without being very like clearly having an interaction. And then they got everything that could be in public space or in social groups, they got absolutely rejected from the beginning. So it was, I felt I didn't understand how we could be talking about social spaces and social groups. Community was a word that was forbidden, and I could on the one hand understand why theoretically it was very conflictual, and it was also for me, but it was also a very contradictory setting for me in that sense. And I had the impression that, and the second thing that came up that was really made me think very much was overproduction. So we were all the time doing projects. I got quite a lot of opportunities for doing projects while I was at the school. So I was all the time working, producing things that then I could go to the openings and say like, well, great, the opening's great. Who's going to come here tomorrow? Who am I doing this exhibition for? What I'm saying with this, or I would go to exhibitions by people in my class and it could be the same sensation, like, well, okay, you have done a project, but what is this project bringing to whoever apart from you having someone else in your CV? Thank you. And I had this impression that there was something in the world of art that was about producing all the time and just catching the opportunities when they come, even if you're not interested, but you are doing it because that could bring you to something else, and then that can bring you to something else, and maybe the 10th thing that you do is interesting. So you could just follow and follow and follow. And I felt very uncomfortable with that, but I really didn't know how you could manage it otherwise. So when I finished Goldsmiths, I decided London was not for me, and I came back to Bilbao. And when I came back to Bilbao, actually, something important happened to me, and it was that there was one teacher at the university at art history where I had studied who was taking a year's leave, and they needed someone for the replacement, and someone who had been my teacher and it's a good friend of mine now. He told me, why don't you apply? So I applied, and I got a teaching job for 1 year. So I started teaching, and I really feel like this a little bit sometimes in class, but with everyone with the mobiles and so on. But I started teaching, and teaching is very important for me. I'm still teaching. I taught for 1 year, and then I was 2 years without teaching, and I've been lecturing for 3 years again, and hoping to continue. Teaching was very important for me for many reasons. The first reason is that I realized how close teaching is from curating, because actually what you are doing is you are selecting from the broad world of knowledge that is out there, that are all interpretations of different things. You are making a selection and you are presenting it to people who are listening to you, in principle without a critical view, just believing what you are going to tell them. So it's very similar to exhibition making for me, because it's a selection of things that you are taking and that you are presenting under a discourse, and that you are where you are very often giving answers that are not at your interpretation, but you're presenting them as answers. With the difference that when you're teaching, you are facing your public is in front of you. So you really get the relationship of how people understand things, how people can understand that what you're saying is your interpretation and not just what is the truth, or putting into question what the truth is. So teaching has been fundamental for me to understand how you present things, which I think is very, very important in curating. So also teaching gave me another thing, that was the possibility to work lecturing and to have time for research and to just select the projects that I'm interested in. So I don't have to get into this thing of I have to do this because then it will bring me to this, because I have to survive, because I have to eat. I eat through my lecturing. I don't earn a lot because I have one of these shitty contracts, but I still can make a living of it, and still gives me some time for research, some time for thinking about what I'm doing, and it's not just producing, but I can select to do just one project for a year because I really can afford to do that, and I can afford the time to think, and I can learn very much through. So that's why I brought in teaching, because I think it's crucial for me. But after teaching 1 year, actually, I had gotten a scholarship before for another institution, which was this was a strange thing, which was the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. I was a resident at the Pavilion, which is a production program for artists and curators. So we were 7 artists, 2 curators. I went to Paris, which is a city I really like, I really love. But this was another year of absolute stress and of absolute overproduction. and of producing with absolutely no sense. So we would arrive there and they would say, okay, we have this money, you have to do a project here all together, you have to do a film about Paris. And there were people who said, well, I arrived to Paris yesterday for the first time in my life. And it was like, no matter, you do the project with everyone else, that's what you are here for. So it was this sensation where you were all the time doing things for no reason, not understanding very well why you were doing it, just because you had been asked to do it or because there was money to do it, so you had to use it. So there were great things in the program. They were things, but I really had this impression that why am I doing these exhibitions? Why I'm working in these projects? They don't mean anything to anyone, and not even to myself. And I don't really have time to think through what I want to do and what I want to say and what are the ideas that I want to come to with this. So the thing is that all this time I was like not feeling that I was answering to anything, and I've always been very interested in what's surrounding me apart from art, like what's the society around me, what's happening with it. And so after finishing Palais de Tokyo, I decided I'm coming back to Bilbao. I'm establishing myself in Bilbao, and I'm going to depart from Bilbao. I'm going to depart from my research, and I'm going to slow down. I'm going to think what I want to do. I'm going to start a PhD. I'm going to think through what it means for me, art in the public space, art, the public space per se, what art is doing when it's working in these spaces. And I'm really, I don't need to be. I don't know if I could have ever been, but I don't need to be a super curator in whatever. I really want to focus for a while on where I am because I really think I need it. So I came back to Bilbao, which is here. You have Bilbao is in the north of Spain, very close to France. It's the 5th biggest city in Spain, but it doesn't mean very much because actually Bilbao, Madrid and Barcelona are really big, but the rest of the big cities in Spain are not that big. So Bilbao is like, I think the city itself, it's 350,000 inhabitants. I mean, it's okay, but it's not a huge city. And then with the whole surrounding is about a bit less than 1 million, like 900,000. But it's a very, I'm not going to go deep into Bilbao because I probably will talk about Bilbao a bit more on Thursday in relation to a project I'm doing there now. But it is a city, it's got a big art school. It's the biggest art school in the north of Spain. And it's got a very interesting history. And it's going through this Bilbao effect process, which really gives a lot to talk about. But there's things going on in there, but at the same time it's big enough and small enough so that you can know where you are. So that was very interesting for me. So that's where I'm departing from. So if I have to sum up what I do and how I do it, I could think, I mean, there are other things that I'm not going to talk like of projects, but I would say that there are 3 points. One I haven't talked about, but it's art critique. I write very much, and it's for me, art critique, lecturing and curating, as I said, they are deeply linked and intertwined with each other, and I cannot separate them. They are just different ways of looking at things, of thinking through things, and of presenting things. I think the 3 of them actually are based in the same methodology, and they are based in research. And then it's just what they produce, or the way you work with artists or with exhibitions or with students is a bit different depending on each case, but it's always like looking at things, interpreting them, admitting that it's your own interpretation, and relating it to other groups of people, making it public. That's how I could define it. But anyways, actually, and then apart from that, I mean, now that I'm in Bilbao, one of the things that I do is that I have some projects of production that I'm working on. I'm finishing my PhD, and I've also done exhibitions. After I settled there and I started to think through my ideas and come to terms with myself and what I thought I wanted to do, it was much easier for me to engage with exhibition making. So I did, these are the last 2 exhibitions. I'm not going to talk about them, and both of them are about how we construct histories, which I think it's a very interesting subject for me, and I think it was relevant in the 2 places where I did this kind of exhibition. So this one I did in 2011, and this one, which is Incomparable Histories, is took place this summer, and it was a very big exhibition. But I do like 1 exhibition per year. I rarely do more than 1 exhibition per year, because I really and if there's no exhibition that I want to do, I just don't do any exhibitions and work with artists or research or do something else. actually, the reason why what I wanted to talk about, and that's I did this introduction, which maybe it doesn't look very clear where I wanted to come, but I hope it's going to become clear through what I'm going to talk about now, which is I wanted to introduce the idea of the commons, and because thinking through the commons and the idea of public space and social engaged practices, I have encountered this term, which is the commons, and it's helping me to think through a lot of things that I had problems to tackle down or to understand, or that I thought were being classified. Very different practices were being classified into very general labels that for me didn't really respond to what was going on in all these different practices. So trying to figure out how I think art can work with a context, and how I think art can relate to that context, I came to this idea of the commons, which I suppose many of you, if not all, have heard about. It's not a new term, but I'm just going to give an overview, and well, maybe we can talk about this idea and how I think it could be interesting if you think about social engaged practices. So let me see what the time is, because I was thinking of, I was thinking actually, do you feel a bit like talking yourself? Because I think everyone's, I was thinking we could do, I would like to do a list of what you consider public and what you consider commons, but I would like you to propose things. I'm going to explain it now. So the idea is that I'm just going to write them in a document, if you don't mind, because we don't have a board, but it's okay. So what I would like to do is like to start thinking about the subject. I would like to, well, we didn't do an introduction, so I don't know exactly what you guys do. So if you want to say something while you just throw ideas, just go for it. But I wanted to do, let's try to gather ideas of what we consider public. It can be spaces, it can be places, it can be ways of doing, it can be whatever. It can be institutions. What could you define as public? When you think of public, what comes to your mind? Yeah. I mean, whoever wants, don't feel obliged to talk, but if you have a I know the micro is not very helpful for...
I mean, maybe it's influenced by your speech, but I think education is the first. But I mean, if I think about an institution and a public space, education should be the first one.
Okay.
I think libraries are really public because you see all types of people, and there's no kind of, you don't feel pressured to leave after a certain time, and I think for me that's really public.
Yeah.
I think what is public is what pertains to the state, and what is common pertains to the people.
Okay.
So, I mean, public, it differs in every country, right? But I think what is the difference between the commons and the public is that the commons are things that, like language, ideas, effects, that are not of the state and also not of some company or some particular.
Yeah. So that they don't belong.
They belong to the people.
Belong to
come
the people.
from the inside, whereas the public is from the state, right?
Yeah.
So it could be all sort of things, but I think the ideas, effects, languages,
Yeah.
those are the commons.
Yeah.
I have the perception that maybe public is more like a political definition, and common goes like beyond borders, or I have just this feeling that reflection.
Yeah. I'm writing everything down. If someone wants to react to whatever you said.
I have the understanding that with public, there's always some sort of public money that goes into it, And so with that comes some boundaries or some agenda or some restriction on the way that you interact with it. It sort of shapes and defines your relationship with the public. And with commons, perhaps it's more internally generated, it's more understood from within, and it's not necessarily determined by external funding sources.
Yeah, I think that I'm totally with them about this idea of public. That is something that maybe is more codified, and it's more related to the duality public and private. And common is something that is much more related to how people decide to shape their life in society.
To shape, that was a nice sentence. Their life in society. Yeah, so more or less it could be like, I think we have different points. Like on the one hand, well, maybe I will come back to the thing. Well, I am going to give a bit of an introduction to how the idea of commons has come around, because some of you maybe know about it, but some other don't. But I think I completely agree with with what you have said. But there is a separation. On the one hand, we would say that public is what is publicly owned, like is what is owned by the state, or is owned by we have this conception that public is owned by all of us, more than by all of us, by a state who represents all of us, but not owned by you directly. So it's more a division of the state. And I don't know if it happens in Italy, but for example in Spain, one thing that happens is that people in general have this perception that public is something that everyone has the right to use, which on the one hand is true, you have the right to use, but it doesn't mean that you have to use it. Like for example, penitentiaries are public, but it doesn't mean that everyone has to go to penitentiary. Or hospitals are public, but it doesn't mean that you have to use the resources of a hospital if you're not ill. But they are more general rules owned by the state and established by the state for supposedly a general good that represents everyone. And the commons, as you said, it's more related. It's well, I'll go through it, but there are different kinds of commons too. So that's why I'm going to do like a small overview of it, and let's see if maybe we can discuss from that. So one of the first commons that were taken into value in these contemporary times was actually the sea, and some of that's why I brought this photo of, I think it's Bari, but I'm not sure. I put Bari in Google, and this is what came up. But it's Bari. I was like, I think it's Bari, but it could be another city in the coast, and I could be confused. But well, anyways, and it's the idea of fishing, and well, this idea of the common lands. Let's say that the first commons that existed, commons is an idea that has come up now again, but actually it's a historical way of using the land. And the land, the sea, and the natural resources. So I think in Italian it's beni comuni, if I'm right. And the first commons, or the commons that are more famous historically, are the shared use of the land. So it's very related to nature, to the use of nature for surviving. And for example, it was quite common in many places. Well, in England, maybe you've heard about the enclosure process in England, where lands that were common and could be used by a community of people were privatized regularly through the time when capitalism started to take force from the Middle Ages on. And the common lands, they were maintained actually in many places for a long time, and they still exist in some places. And well, I brought a couple of examples, like for example in the Basque Country where I come from, it was very normal, and it happened until about 40 years ago, that they were common lands where you had chestnut trees, because chestnuts were a very basic resource for feeding, for eating for people. They were used instead of potatoes historically, and so it was and they are, you can keep them for a long time, and they have a lot of protein, so people used to gather them for themselves and for the animals. So they were these big chestnut tree plantations, well, not plantations, natural resources that grow by themselves, and they didn't belong to anyone, but there were some rules of how many chestnuts you could, how many kilos you could use, and you had to take care of the space, and you had to clean it, and you had to keep it as it was. You could never overgo, and they didn't belong to the town, but everyone in the town could use them if they followed these laws. And actually, I know people who still went for chestnuts in common lands for chestnuts in the Basque Country about, like I would say, like 40, 50 years ago. So they stayed until quite late, and then they got privatized. And another traditional commons in Spain, I'm talking about the Spanish ones because I know them better, but this is very linked to a very Spanish product, which is the jamón, like the ham, and you can see the pigs. Actually, I don't know the name of this tree, encina. Do you know? Bellotas, oak? No, oak is roble. It's the kind of tree that gives this kind of nuts that the pigs eat. So they are also in the south of Spain. There are big lands of these trees, and there used to be a lot more, where all the people in the town, they just bring their pigs, leaves them there, and the pigs just get fed on these nuts. And then, of course, you could also use, in the Basque Country it was the same, you could use the wood for fire, you could use the leaves for compost, you could use different resources, and people could just use them together. They are called dehesas. If someone's been to Spain, maybe you've heard about it. It's a quite common word, and they still exist, some of them, but most of them were privatized. So this is kind of land commons that were historically used, and there were commons like this everywhere. And yeah. There was regulations. That's one of the things with the common lands, with the commons in general, natural resources, is that they always have regulations. The thing is that the regulations are established not by the state or by the municipality, but by the users. So normally they were regulations about how many pigs you could bring, for example. It's the users who establish what the limit of the resource is. That's one of the characteristics of the commons, natural resource commons, is that the users, recognizing what was the limit of the commons, they could agree among themselves, normally in a quite assemblearian way, how they were going to use it. So everyone who was into the commons could participate in these rules, in changing them, but had to accept them too. So and they were fines for the people who did not follow them. So there was legislation. This is actually an idea that I'm coming to that. I'm coming to that right away. So just one thing, because this is a thing very important for Italian. It's a very good example of the commons now, of common resources, which is this campaign about the water in Italy in 2011. And maybe someone can tell a bit about the micro.
I guess the privatization of water, actually it was also a big issue in this region. I don't know, basically there was a very strong reaction from the citizenship, because for us it was just unacceptable to think that the water could get privatized. But nevertheless it's still like an open case, and it seems something like unresolved for the country. So it's highly controversial.
Yeah, and this is it's a very interesting example, because actually in Italy there's a university in Trento where they are working very hard on the legislation of the commons, because the thing with the commons is that the legislation, the commons normally serve a group of people, so it's the group of people who establish the rules. But when it becomes very big, the tendency is either to privatize it or to make it public. When it becomes public, very often what happens is that it doesn't respond to the specific groups that are using it, but it goes border to a more abstract general society. And then very often getting public is the first way to then get privatized. Like I think it's happening everywhere in Europe, and especially in Italy, Spain, Greece, and Portugal. I think a lot of services and resources are getting privatized. But Italy was a very interesting case because they tried to privatize the use of water, and this university in Trento, well, there was this big campaign with a lot of associations. There was a referendum, and you voted against the privatization, so it was a very important landmark for a commons to be maintained as a commons. But the problem is that there is not general legislation for the commons, because the legislation is based on public and private, and the commons legislation, they normally don't enter into a general, more general politics. So there's this university in Trento, and I suppose more people, but I know these people in Trento who are leading, they are lawyers who are working on how to establish a legislation for the commons, specifically for the water. And they are doing very interesting work. I mean, I cannot really explain very much because it's about laws, but it's very interesting that they are trying to find a legal way of preserving commons, and that they cannot escape from the common domain. So I think Italy has a very interesting recent history on natural resources and commons, and it's really nice also that this referendum got really attended, and that the response was very clearly not to privatize the commons. Sure.
It's obvious, but it's even more interesting to reflect upon the introduction of the privatization of anything in countries like the pigs, where the welfare is very low or more or less non-existent. So in Italy, our welfare is almost zero. We used to say that our welfare is our families, which are supporting us because there is nothing. So, and it's dangerous and quite scary to think about the fact that this will become more and more like a sort of common land for the private to interact with services, because when the state cannot really offer things, then the private start to be more and more like present, because it's one of the shortest, like, I don't know how to say, like one of the easiest answer for a country to get private services when there are not public service offered.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely like that, and it's a big problem, the privatization of services and resources. I completely agree in our countries. And the family thing is absolutely like that in Spain. Your family is your state. So Spain is not in a bigger crisis because everyone has come back to live with their parents, basically, with the big crash of mortgages. Not everyone, but a lot of people, but because of the family support. So, and that maybe we can come back to that later on too. So, well, just as this idea of coming back to what you were asking about, if they are governed together, like a little bit of coming back to how the commons, because the commons, as I said, they were a historical resource that was getting was disappearing and was getting privatized. If you want to read a very, very good book on the privatization of the commons in England, linked to the witch hunting, it's Silvia Federici. I don't know if you've heard of her. I think she's just brilliant and wonderful. And the book, it's called Caliban and the Witch, and it's a wonderful book about how the privatization of common spaces in England, but also the privatization of women's of spaces used by women who were taken out from them on accusations of witchery. So it was a way of taking land and taking property from women, or taking use from spaces, and it's just a wonderful book. Well, as I said, the commons were apparently not something that most people knew about, or that didn't exist so much. And then in the 60s, I think it was 60s, 70s, they got a final hit by Garrett Hardin, who is the one down there, who presented this idea. This is economics, yeah. And Garrett Hardin presented this idea of the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons, what he said was that the commons are unsustainable, common lands, he was referring to resources, because everyone in society, he was departing from this idea of the man is a wolf to himself. So he departed from the idea that if you have a resource that you can use, like for example, if you have 6 pigs and you have a commons where you can feed 3 pigs, if you can feed your 6 pigs, why would you only feed 3? So you could use the commons to your own benefit, not thinking on the others, and that means that commons could be overused and could be depleted and could be finished. So it's the same with fishery. That's why I brought the sea, because, for example, fishing is another good example of how communities arrange how much you can fish, in which seasons, what kind of fishes, so that you don't exterminate some kinds of fishes and end up the resource for the coming generations. So Garrett Hardin, what he said was that, well, actually that doesn't work, because people just look for their own interest. So if you can have the best of it, why could you have less just for the good of other people? So he presented this idea where if the commons are unsustainable because people overuse them, and if they have the option they will overuse them, so the only way of saving these resources was either to make them public, so there was a general rule that was establishing rules for everyone, or to make them private so that someone would take care for them. So he divided only these possibilities of sustain for resources. The public could be the state. Yeah, it could be the state, the municipality, but always something that is representative and normally parliamentarian. And the rules could not be just for the users, but for all, which is something that is very interesting, because the commons normally are defined by the users and not by the all. So, for example, why, I suppose you're not a fisherwoman, so why could you be voting on how much fish a fisher can fish if you are not using that resource, for example? So the idea of the public is that people outside from that common who actually don't use it or don't know how to manage it, they take decisions upon it, and people who use it, they don't have the option to take decisions upon it. That is the possible problem of the public, which doesn't always happen, but it can happen.
Was there any regulation on the commercial use you could make out of, out of the profit you would have of the commons?
Not normally. Normally, the commons, you could use them. No, not normally, not really. No, because I'm thinking of examples. For example, one of the commons that...
No,
yeah.
If you would make hamon, is there anything that kind of should go back into the...
No. You had a limit of the pigs you could bring, for example. But, for example, if you had 1 pig and I had 3, I could make more money of it. But we could just use it in the terms in which we need it. So actually, it's more about you use it as you need it, in some limits, than really the profit you can get from it. And I was thinking of irrigation, which is also a very famous common. Actually, if you used irrigation and you produce much more because you had many more lands than someone else. Come back. It didn't matter. It's not about how much profit. It's not, let's say, communist in that way that everyone has to earn the same. Normally there was a limitation on what you made of it. It's more of what you use of it, but not how much you win from it. Yeah, which is an interesting question, actually.
There's a whole capital.
Yeah.
Once it enters the capital market.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think the idea was that what enters the capital logic is not the commons. It's the product you can. Yeah. So while this comes back, if it does, I hope it will. What happened was that this Garrett Hardin's theory, it kind of smashed the idea of the commons. Then in 1990, a woman called Elinor Ostrom, who actually won then the Nobel Prize for economics, which was quite interesting because she is actually she's not working on economics. She is working on politics. Well, she died last year, but she spent many years of her life taking examples of commons that already existed in the world, and what she did was she showed that actually they were commons that were 500-600 years old that had been managed as commons for all that time. And for example, the fisheries were one of them. Another one was the irrigation systems in Valencia, which are coming from the Muslim times of Spain, so from the Middle Ages, and are still managed as commons generally. And she brought hundreds of examples, and she said, first of all, commons are sustainable. Commons can feed a community, and actually they are more just to that community that uses them very often than public law. And then she said, we cannot establish very general rules for commons because they respond to the necessities of the community they are serving. So each community establishes their, and she gave a lot, if you want to read the book, it's called Governing the Commons, and it's very economical, but it's quite easy to understand, being like theory of economics. But it's really interesting because she gives examples of things that are absolutely different, like very different ways of managing, very different rules. Some of them are very, very small and very controlled, and some others are quite big. So it's really interesting. And what she said was like, no, that's not true. The tragedy of the commons is not a rule. It doesn't always exist. So let's look at this idea of the commons, because they are trying to hide it from us, but actually it does work and it exists in many places, and it's worth looking at. So the commons came up to life again, and well, I'm going to play you one little video, which explains quite well. I think it's a funny one. So it's a very short introduction to what I said. Well, let's see if it works. There it goes.
Why does she actually play alone? And why are they all excluded? That's not fun. Would it not be more sensible to do something together? Wouldn't that be clever? And would life not be better for all of us then? But the world is different. Why is that? Our whole life is based on resources, and these include not just biodiversity, but also social spaces in our cities and towns, education and the sciences, and all of the digital world. And actually, there is enough of these resources available for every single person. Yet, the world is different, as nature is being enclosed, social space is increasingly being privatized, access to education is turned into a commodity, and freedom in the digital world is shrinking in favor of private monopolies. Some call it use rights. The reason for it is simple. Whoever makes a commodity short in supply creates scarcity, and whoever creates scarcity can make a whole lot of money out of it. This is how it has to be. Say at least those who benefit. And at first glance, it all sounds fairly reasonable. The argument goes as this: whoever leaves resources to the people themselves seals the destiny of their ruthless overuse. Just imagine a village pasture. Here, every shepherd may let his sheep graze. But why only one sheep? After all, profits would be much higher if there were 10. If every shepherd was to act in this way, the pasture would be depleted in no time. The villagers were to lose their livelihood. Sounds plausible, doesn't it? However, people tend to act differently. They talk to each other. They establish rules. They take on responsibility for the commons, and they assure their preservation. They know that they depend on one another. The advantage of one person is also the advantage of another. This is the idea behind the commons. It is about communities that establish their own rules for managing their commons. And every single one of them makes sure that the commons continue to grow for everyone, no matter whether in nature, society, education, culture, or the internet. It is an idea that is lived throughout the world on a daily basis. And without this idea, even the big questions like education, health, climate change, or global food security cannot be answered.
So this is like Commons for the children, but I thought it was really funny. So it's like what I've been more or less explaining in a very condensed way. And one of the things that it mentioned, and that when we talked you mentioned too, is that actually most of you didn't refer to the commons as a natural commons, but you referred to the other set of commons. Because from these recovering when Elinor Ostrom recovered, let's say, the idea of the commons and put it into the market again, not the best expression, but well, what happened was that it exploded through the idea of the internet. The internet took this idea of the commons because the internet was producing a lot of resources that could be shared and that were immaterial and that needed a completely different legislation and that could be used as commons. And they didn't know how to grasp this idea of how to organize what was starting to grow in there. So the commons was embraced by but by many people in the internet to try to organize new communities in which they would create knowledge and intangible things and immaterial ideas that they could then share with others. And that was quite interesting because then from there it has been applied to many fields. So one of, for example, the clearest example of what is a common in the internet is the Wikipedia, because the Wikipedia is something where everyone can contribute with their knowledge and everyone can access it and can consult it. It's open, but it doesn't belong to anyone really, and it could be commercialized. That is something that is, I'm not going to get very much into that, but the commons can always be privatized. It's not that because they are commons they cannot. They actually are privatized all the time or used by private interests to produce money, but well, at the moment it's not, and it's something where you can collaborate with it, you make it richer, and everyone can consult it and use that knowledge that is there for everyone to accept. So the thing is that until some years, let's say the world was divided into two spheres, which would be the public and the private. And the way of defining the public of the private was very often based on the emphasis on exclusion. So who can access it? If it's public, everyone can access it. If it's private, private is defined by the negation of access to it, and then by subtractability, which means that if you take it from someone else. So it's someone else's. So if you take of it, you are hindering someone from using it. So using these two ideas, the idea of the public and the private, were drawn like the two general spheres where the work could be defined. But actually, as you very well said, there are, for example, languages, which is a very interesting way of commons. There is knowledge, for example, academic knowledge. There is, like I was saying, the Wikipedia knowledge, the knowledge that is in the internet or in other places, but also everyday knowledge, community knowledge. This is a very important part of the commons, and it's, for example, in Spain, it's been a big discussion now, which is the cares. The cares is who takes care, all the work that is done to take care of the others, like who takes care of the children, who takes care of the elderly, all the work that is normally organized by a community to take care of the people who cannot take care of themselves, of the ill, but not so much in the health system, but more in the everyday familiar basis. Like the family is very much based on the common work of some people for the whole community, and the divide of work with other people and taking care of other people for the whole community. So the cares, for example, I say it's a big discussion in Spain because a lot of cares are being privatized or taken out from public stipendium, and they are coming back to the family who normally have to, well, going into private hands, and well, it's like a big discussion. And then the commons, there's also the collaboration systems and agreements. Like for the commons actually, well, and of course all that could come into the idea of the commons. And for example, the language is something that is very interesting because these kind of immaterial commons, they have a difference with the natural resource commons, which is the natural resource commons. They have normally a very established set of rules, and the group of users is very defined, while these immaterial commons, they have very often very open and not defined groups of users, which makes that the rules for them are different because it's much more difficult to gather all together and establish some rules for it. So it's a different way of managing them. Do you wanted to ask something?
Yes. When you talk about the people caring for each other,
yeah.
do you mean that
it's not only inside your family, it's also people, for example, a person takes care of elderly people in general without asking any money for it and just doing it for...
No, but it happened, for example, with children that the very most normal example is the park. So you take your child to the park, and there are like 7 mother and fathers with their children, and you have to go shopping, and you say, hey, I have to go shopping, can I leave my child with you? So you would just leave the child there, go for shopping, someone else would take her, like you have 3 parents taking care of 7 children, and then you would come back another day, you would stay for it. So there's always been a big community of, and for example, it happened also in small towns with elderly people. So if you had someone who was, you could normally put the all neighbors together so they could chat and entertain each other, and then only one person had to be with them just in case someone happened. But in Spain, what's happening more with the cares is that there was this was common work, and at some point it was made public. So there was a specific stipendium for people who had dependent people on them, so all elderly people who could not take care of themselves, very often who could not wake up from bed, normally ill people or people with different kind of problems that needed care constantly. There was a public help for someone in the family to stay at home, and that work to be paid as a paid work, so that the family didn't have to take that responsibility, economical responsibility, on themselves. And with the new government, the government that we have now, which is privatizing everything, that help has been abolished, which means that it comes back to the families, which is a problem for the families that don't have this support right now, and people who are not working, or people who don't have any money, or who really have to go to work because they have to pay for a house. So it's something that goes from the commons to the public and then comes back to the commons. But the thing is that the network of the commons was broken when it was gotten into the public. So now it's difficult to reestablish that again. So still people take care of them, of everyone, but it's economically is a weight on them, and sometimes it's very difficult to manage. You? I'm curious,
I'm interested in this cycle and the way that you've illustrated commons in the center, public and private, because it seems that, as we move further and further into private, as you were saying, it becomes more difficult to come back into the notion of commons, which is much more of an intuitive and natural way of behavior. What strategies, or what do you think it would require for sort of reintegration or re-education into a common system from private?
Well, actually, the thing with the commons is that I'm talking here generally of the commons, but there are super different kind of commons, and that's also something that is particular of the commons. That is that, they respond to the necessity of a community. So it's very difficult to make general laws, because they can be very different in different places, and it's absolutely not at all the same a fishery, for example, with academic knowledge.
Maybe we can be more specific, and maybe we can focus on the example you gave us about caretaking and this, caring for your elderly and other generations.
Yeah.
How do you think that might transition back into a common system away from this privatized system?
I don't know. I will give some examples later of curatorial programs that I think are thinking of the commons in ways that I think are interesting, trying to enhance them or like to empower them. But you.
Because last year I made an interview with Elke Otaintus. Sorry for the pronunciation, because and she's an artist and promoter of an example of commons that I found very enlightening, just because they use the private property for the commons.
Yeah.
And the project is called Dement Common, actually, and it's because there was a score that was going to lose a space for like a project room because of the cultural cuts, and they promoted a campaign to let the people buy this space, putting a little budget.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know. Yeah, I'm sure. And it was, I mean, very interesting. Now I don't know at which point they are actually, but buying a piece of the space meant having the possibility to vote for their cultural program. That is a little bit controversial, but I think it's a good example of this kind of practice.
Yeah, no, I will give 2 examples more related to art. With the curse, I think it's difficult. People, what they are trying to do generally, it's also so the idea is normally with the commons is to establish laws and regulations like with the water that would support these commons, but not make them public. So, for example, that if you organize among your group of people for children to be taken care every day by 2 people, for example, that you get the support for a space where these children can be, that you get that the people who are there have a compensation for a salary they are not earning, or normally it's not so much about being paid for the work you're doing, but having the resources to keep it and having the possibility of establishing your own rules. And there are some projects that are trying to promote that this idea of the commons gets into the legislation in some way that at the same time protects it but doesn't touch it, because the problem with legislation is that sometimes it establishes very general rules for everyone. So it's to find a way in which you give resources to these networks to keep working or to reinvent themselves, and you give importance to them, but at the same time you don't cut them with legislations that don't apply to them. So it's very complicated. Normally, I think it works more intuitively at this point because there's no legislation in most of the cases, so it just a group develops and establishes a series of rules. But in the case of the cars, also in Spain, for example, it's a discussion also if it should go into public, not only commons, but into public, in the public realm. So it is considered as a work, paid as such and respected as such too. But it's curse is not one of my specialties, actually. That's why I'm just giving these general ideas. But then I will come to specific examples with that I did for my PhD in Stockholm, which I think could be really interesting. Yeah, and one of the differences that is very important with the commons is if they are subtractive or non-subtractive, and that means if they finish up if you use them, like could be with fisheries, like could be with the chestnuts, like could be with the example we have seen with the sheep, or if they are like Wikipedia, because one of the things that is very new and very interesting in the material commons, like languages or like knowledge, is that the more you use them, the more you enrich them, but you don't finish them up, which is not the case with fisheries or with other natural resources, which means that you can establish different sets of rules because you don't have to control so much the use of them, because the use of them doesn't like give any kind of problematic to them. So it requires different kinds of organization around it. So it's an important point, the idea of being subtractive or non-subtractive. Like, do they last forever if we use them, or they don't? And the good thing with immaterial and knowledge is that they last forever. The more you use them, the more they live. So and that is, for example, and like the fisheries is the example of the one that ends up if you don't organize them and if you don't control how you use that resource. And the language, I took this one because I was looking for an image like of Barese, for example, and I found this woman with the orecchietti, and I thought it was kind of nice, but well, it's super folklorical. Sorry about that. But no, but the idea of the language. I also come from the place where I come from, the Basque country. We have our own language, which is official in Spain, which is Basque language, and language is a very good example. The more people you use them, the more it stays, the more it develops, and it gets changed by the use of these people. There are new words that come in. There are influences from other languages or there are new changes in grammars, but it's a living entity that develops with use. It doesn't end. So I think language is a very beautiful example of something that is common, and that we often, and you were saying about intuitive, which I think it's a very nice word for commons, because what I think is very interesting with commons is that we actually have much many commons than we think. and we intuitively we have them and we manage them intuitively, but we are not aware of them as commons. And that is what I think is very interesting also for art relating to public space, like going a bit further, that very often when we talk about public space, we are not talking about public space, we are talking about common organizations, and we are talking about ways of managing the commons. And because we are not being aware of that world and being aware of everything that can go with it, we have difficulties to address it, and we often don't know how to go through it. Or so, well, I'm going a bit further. So just a couple of ideas of like theoreticians saying about the commons, like Ostrom and Hess, Elinor Ostrom that I mentioned before, talking about the knowledge commons. They said that they find them as resources that are jointly used, managed by groups of varying sizes and interests. So it's really, really wide. But then if you want to see things about commons, David Bollier, you have in bollier.org. He is one of the main theorists, and he's got a lot of very interesting introductory text to the common, plus good bibliography and so on. And I took these 4 points of him from a post that is like new to the commons, so it's like very introductory to the commons. It's like the main points that he thinks describe a commons and that we have to take into account. So the first one is that it's a social system for the long-term stewardship of resources that preserves shared values and community identity. So that is a commons. It's what is very interesting in knowledge and in what David Bollier is saying, and said by many people more, is that the common is not actually only the resource, but it's also the social system that we build to maintain that resource. That is also the commons. So the legislation, the talking together, the assembly system, the democratic system that we use to manage that commons, that is also the commons. Not only the fishes or of the land, but the arrangements that we get to for the commons. And they normally help to preserve shared values and community identity. Another one is it's a self-organized system, very important that it's self-organized, by which communities manage resources which can be depletable and replenishable, with minimal or no reliance on the market or state. So it's also it can be related in some cases. It can have support from public funding, for example, but it's independent from the market and the state. It's another way of organizing resources and property.
Well, I think it's very interesting what you were mentioning, and actually I grew up in a small place in the mountains close to where actually she lives, in Bolzano in Trento. And since the 12th century basically there are these rules, and the name is rules, and at the beginning they were silent rules, so people agreed and there was nothing written, and then things started to change, and so they had to write things, and as soon as they wrote, they could not exist anymore somehow, because as far as something gets written, it gets damaged. And there are some communities still living on these kind of rules, but it's not that easy. And so I don't know if this is the system which changes, but going back to that kind of thing will destroy them again. So I think it's a very interesting topic to develop, but I don't see, maybe I think we should go closer to the cultural aspect, because I'm too much more still in the historical. Yeah. So maybe if you can find some interesting things to also, I'm sure that they will call them, but I don't see the connection with cultural aspects and curatorial, because I'm still maybe too close to myself. So
okay. No, I'm coming to it.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I'm coming right away. So. So well, these points, I don't know if you want to see them anyways. It's the ones like the wealth that we inherit or create together. I think these all actually are relating to culture. I think they talk more about culture than they talk about fisheries, like the wealth that we inherit or create together and must pass on undiminished or enhanced to our children. Our collective wealth includes the gifts of nature, civic infrastructure, cultural works and traditions and knowledge. And then the last one is the cares. So a sector of the economy and life that generates value in ways that are often taken for granted. So cares of children, elderly, and so on, and often jeopardized by the market state. So that's like the 4 points of him. And I will and the 3 points that they mentioned that are necessary for a commons. And I think this comes also in terms with culture. Like if you're working with collective, if you're working with people engaged in socially active practice, normally like the 3 points that I could underline could be like, well, that they underline, and I think they are very important. One is collective action. Another one is self-governance. And the third one is social capital. So that you have a social, like a social wealth that you can share. So coming to the examples, the first thing I wanted to show you, I'm going to show you 2 examples of Stockholm, of art spaces in Stockholm. But before that, I also wanted to show you the idea of the problematic between the public and the common. I would just say it like the public and the common, they are not good or bad per se. It's how you use them that can make them good or bad, or that can have different influences. So I'm going to show you a big commons that we had in Bilbao and was demolished. So it was, and I think it's an interesting example. I won't talk very long about it, but so this was it was an occupied space. It was an old factory. So to start with, the building was a historical building of Bilbao, and it had been abandoned for a while. It was a big factory, and then it was occupied by a group of people in a neighborhood, and they used it for cultural activities. After I think like more than 15 years using it, and now I will put the lift up thing because it's kind of interesting, so that you can see the space and how they managed it and what there was. The owner of the place decided to turn it down and to use the space for building houses and speculation and so on. And there was a big outcry from the neighborhood, saying that they wanted to maintain it as a cultural space. But the public policies of the town that are not agreeing with this kind of aesthetics, because they want the Guggenheim aesthetics, like being very general, they decided that they were not going to declare it cultural grounds, so it could be built upon, and it was destroyed last year. So they did this lift up to show, like to reclaim it. So it's the building there. You will see. They will go there in a second, and you can see what kind of space it was and what kind of resources they were giving. This was the building. It was a factory from the 30s, and one of the things they had was a theater and a puppet school. They had ethnic music classes from different people coming from different places in the world, so they gave different classes of different ethnic music. There was a circus school. This was a circus school, and where they did the representation. That's the concert hall. Well, the song is by a quite very famous Basque group, and it talks about built together through our common hands and this idea. This was the Feminist Council that also had their meeting space, and they gave like empowering classes in there. They also had a common market, you know, like suppliers bringing things and they could buy eco products and things produced locally. They had a common restaurant where everyone could take care of cooking for 1 week and you could eat for very cheap money. They had a place for designing t-shirts, things like doing different workshops with children. This is the free shop. Do you have free shop? Where you bring the things you don't need and people can go and take it and exchange it for something they don't need anymore. They had a printing facilities. Dance classes, yoga. I'm waiting to get to the... There was something quite impressive too, that let's see if we get there. So what you see, this is the yoga classes, circus school, children's spaces. For example, this was a place where people in the neighborhood could bring their children and just leave them for the afternoon if they had to work. And there was always someone taking care of them. And then, let's see if it arrives there. This is the theater. Well, all this was common work. All the cultural activities were for very little money because they did hire the teachers. So, for example, there were flamenco classes. I think they come to the flamenco class. This is the gym. So the teachers were paid, but you just paid for like the money the teachers could get. But for example, the bar was for free. The internet resources were for free. Most of the resources you could just go and use them. And then they had groups who take responsibility of the maintaining of the place. There were some people who were living there for free, and in charge of that they could maintain in it. Well, you see it's huge. It's enormous. They had karate classes. They had like incredible. It was the biggest cultural space in Bilbao, and everything was self-managed and voluntary. And this is what I wanted to show you. This was the best rocodrome in Spain. It was labeled as the best rocodrome in Spain. They built it all together, with themselves, because in the Basque Country it's quite popular. Climbing is very, very popular. So they built a rocodrome, which is not very high, but it's quite steep. So they follow the different legislations, blah blah blah. So it was best rocodrome in Spain inside the building, and they built it themselves. So I think it was a very interesting, place. And well, they demolished it, which goes into the rules of what Bilbao is today, but that's another issue. So that's, for example, an example of social activities and cultural activities organized through the commons and through the use of the space. Wasn't public, it was private, but the use of it was a use of a community, of different communities using it for different things. And I don't know if you want to do if you want to take a break, or should I go with examples from Sokol?